There's a debate over whether New Zealand churches should be taxed. In his studio to talk about this is Reverend Grant Harris, who's a senior pastor of Windsor Park Baptist Church in Auckland City. Good morning, Rev.
Good morning. Great to be here.
Thank you for your company and thanks for coming in this morning. Now, we're not going to, we don't know anything about, well, we do know a little bit, but you're the expert around this, okay? So what is this debate over the churches being, should they be exempt from taxes or not?
Yeah, I think there's a perception around from some quarters of our society that thinks that a church makes, significant amounts of money, and so we should be paying tax like anybody else kind of pays tax. But really, it's a really misinformed debate for a number of different reasons. Firstly, you've got to understand the tax system. We pay tax on surplus, so a business pays tax on what it makes, its profit at the end of the day. 99.5% of us as churches don't make profit or surplus. We use pretty much everything that we get for what we do as churches. So, make us pay tax, no problem. I know for our church, it might pay for lunch for a few people or something like that. But
churches often run on a pretty slim margin, a lot of them.
We run on a zero budget pretty much every year.
Well, we know this, right? As churchgoers.
Totally.
But the perception is of people looking outside in.
I think there's definitely a perception, and it comes through from probably some fairly, negative views of people from a minority of churches within our country. But, we have thousands of churches that don't get any media attention. We just get on and do what we do.
Yeah.
So you would say that perception is reality for some people, but you also have to balance that out with an understanding of our tax system and how it works and how the charitable sector works as well. So it's one thing to say tax churches, but under the Human Rights Act, they can't tax churches specifically or remove our charitable status because you can't discriminate under religious grounds under the Human Rights Act. So really, let's have the discussion about the charitable sector then, of which there are 28,000 charities in our country and some really big ones. So really the discussion has to be about, do we tax that whole sector? And let's be honest, that's not going to be a great political move.
Do you think it's more about perception? Because, churches do pay taxes in some ways, right? If you've got employees at the church, they would all have to pay income tax on their salaries and things like that, right?
So we pay tax on all of our employees across our ministries. We have about 170 staff. We pay all PAYE taxes and
all
everything
of
that we have to do, totally. So I think the perception is around people thinking that we should pay tax on our income, on what we get at the top of the profit and loss account. But that's not how the tax system works.
Is there a perception problem with maybe, you obviously arrived in the Windsor Park Bentley this morning.
Oh, I got the helicopter.
But there's some churches that maybe have a flashier look or whatever. So the perception of people who maybe are not part of the church when they see that are like, oh yeah, well that's all great because you're tax free, so you just get to spend all this money on blah blah blah. Yes. But really, it's not really connected like that. But is it also wrapped up in around when you have older institutions that maybe have a lot of land holdings, they have huge assets, they have, that are built up over hundreds of years sometimes.
Totally.
And people see that and are like, well, what's really going on here? Maybe it's just ignorance if they don't know what the church actually does, but they're like, what's the public good of this? Why are they tax-free?
I think that is absolutely true, but perception is reality for some people for what they see. So that comes down to the responsibility, I think, for us as churches and as Christians to be really good stewards of what we have. And often that lands and those assets have been built up over a long, long time. And a lot of that is just because markets rise and assets increase in value. So we have a job to do in how we come across as churches and what we do in the community, how we portray ourselves. And I think that's really valid. I think that's a really Christian attitude to have as well. We are stewards of our assets. We are scripturally to be good managers of that which is entrusted to us. So how we go about doing our ministry and doing what God would have us do, I think is a really valid point. But again, it would generally be the minority, as it is in lots of situations, the minority view of some of, that flashiness. It's not indicative really of the mainstream of Christianity.
So why is it such a big deal that we're talking about it now?
Oh, we've been talking about it for a long time. Every year, for example, that Sanitarium releases its results. Everyone's like, churches should be taxed. Sanitarium's owned by the Seventh-day Adventist Church, so they don't pay any tax on their profit, which is normally between about $70, $80 million a year. So that often comes out every year. There is things about that. And every year that a flash church perhaps gets in the media for some reason, that discussion arises. But it's a short-sighted discussion, and it's really an ill-informed discussion. But I think we do have a responsibility to think about, what we do with our assets and the money that people give to us that allows us to be the church. And we could be a little bit smarter, perhaps, in letting our society know, what we do. Although, that's kind of fraught with difficulty as well.
I think a lot of it does come down to perception, eh? Right? Because, like you said, the sanitarium thing always comes up because people are like, what do Weet-Bix got to do with religion? You know,
right.
and why are they not paying tax on Weet-Bix? You know, and all that kind of stuff. And I don't really know the answers to that stuff. It's beyond me. But and then it all gets lumped together, right? And then you get individual churches that are mainly run by volunteers and they've got no money whatsoever, and all they do is try and look after their community. And then they're like, oh, and someone now thinks we're getting away with all of this cash somewhere that we've never seen before.
Yes, and I think that's very true. And so maybe it's a PR exercise that we have to think a little bit about as churches and what we do in that space. But, there are massive charities in New Zealand as well that do amazingly good things in our country. And so together, we're part of that charitable sector, 28,000 charities in New Zealand doing a lot of stuff together. Some people want to pick against churches because of perhaps some experience or some thought that they have around the value of religion in our society. And that's a perception that I guess we can correct through who we are, how we go about our work, but there's always going to be a minority that maybe affects the rest of us.
Well, let's just touch on the minority just for a second, Rev, and talk about the value that churches actually do provide society for those listening going, well, okay, well, what actually do you do?
Well, I think the reality around that, and there is some work being done behind the scenes in some church circles to kind of put some kind of value upon that. I mean, really, if you added it up, it would be hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars of public service, charity, community service.
Yeah, social impact, all that
social impact
stuff.
is massive. But again, perhaps we haven't been as great as actually gathering that data, looking at those analytics and presenting it to the government and saying, well, what we add to the society could be about this value. We're actually with you. We're helping you do your job as charitable organisations.
I guess it's like when you put it that way of like how could you change the perception? Because this conversation does come up every probably election cycle for different reasons and whatever. Things get in the news. But if people that are not even connected to the church don't belong to a church, but automatically when they think of a church, their local church, they're like, those guys are great. Like I've seen all the good that they do, that they look after our lowest, they feed people, and do all of these good things. If that's what we were well known for in New Zealand, then I don't think the question around taxation would even be the first thing on people's minds.
Totally. And that's a problematic kind of discussion to have because we aren't really about sort of showing people what we do and, we're great, we're doing all this. We just get on with it, right?
Yeah.
Local churches in our communities, we just get on and do the mahi. We just do it. And we aren't really about employing PR people to kind of show you how great we are. We just want to be there.
That would also probably bring up the conversation again. If they're like, look, they've got a PR team.
It got raised a little bit recently because the Prime Minister was asked a question and whether he would consider taxing churches, and he said he was open to it. So, it all went crazy from there. But in the context of his discussion, he also said he was up at looking at the tax regime across the charitable sector, which I don't actually think that he would do. I don't think it's on the government's agenda, and really it would open a can of worms that he probably didn't anticipate.
Finally, from me, the key takeaway from this discussion this morning is about there's lots that we can consider and lots of positivity around what you've been saying. But as another angle, look at maybe churches looking at their own accountability and what they're actually using their resources for.
I think that's entirely the gospel. We should be good stewards, good managers, but we also need to be wise as well around how we go about being the hands and feet and how we portray that, how our love displays itself in our society. And I think that speaks louder than words.
If they were to tax churches, as this conversation sort of started, would that affect people's charitable giving? Because obviously, if you don't know, if you give to a church or any charity, non-for-profit, you can claim back a third of that when you do your tax returns. Would that void all of that as well?
That would be an issue, but that applies across the charitable sector. And we would ask the question, would that affect people's giving to our church? Do people give because they're going to get a third back?
Terrible investment if you are.
Well, I'm kind of like, if that's the motivation for someone's giving, then don't give it to start with.
Yeah. Been an interesting conversation this morning. Thanks for your insight, Rev.
Pleasure.
We appreciate you dropping in.
Yeah.
Grant Harris, Senior Pastor at Windsor Park Baptist Church in Auckland City. Take care. God bless, Rev.
Thank you. Cheers.
No reply in Departure Lounge. This is Life FM.